Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
My apartment is small but cozy. I've got my little setup in the living room with a decent sound system I saved up for months to buy. Nothing fancy, just a regular stereo and some speakers that let me actually enjoy movies and music without having to strain to hear dialogue or bass lines. After long days at work dealing with demanding clients and tight deadlines, coming home to unwind with some music or a good movie is basically my therapy. The building has 18 units, and most of my neighbors are pretty cool. There's a young couple upstairs who occasionally has friends over, some college students down the hall who party on weekends, and various working people like me, just trying to get by. Everyone seems to understand that living in a building with paper-thin walls requires a bit of tolerance and common sense. Everyone except my next-door neighbors. This old lady and her husband moved in about 3 months after I did. Right from the start, I could tell she was the type who probably asks to speak to managers everywhere she goes. She had this permanent scowl and would give me dirty looks whenever we passed in the hallway, like I'd personally ruined her day just by existing. The first time it happened, I was watching an action movie on a Tuesday night around 8 o'clock. The volume was at a reasonable level, maybe a notch above what I'd use for regular TV watching, because action scenes need a little oomph to be enjoyable. Suddenly, there's this aggressive banging on my door. I opened it to find 2 police officers standing there looking somewhat annoyed. They told me they got a noise complaint from my neighbor who said I was playing music too loud and disturbing the peace. I explained that I was just watching a movie and the volume wasn't even that high. They asked if they could come in and check. I let them in and they stood there for a moment listening to my TV. One officer said this was barely louder than normal conversation level. The other agreed that this wasn't what he'd call disturbing the peace. They basically told me I wasn't doing anything wrong but asked if I could maybe turn it down just a tiny bit to keep the peace. I did, even though I knew I shouldn't have to. A week later, same thing. I was listening to some classic rock while cleaning my apartment on a Saturday afternoon. Not blasting it, just background music while I vacuumed and did dishes. Again, the cops showed up. The same officer told me it was the same neighbor with the same complaint. This time they didn't even need to come inside. They could hear from the doorway that my music was perfectly reasonable. The second officer told me I was well within my rights, but asked if I would mind turning it down anyway. Again, I complied because I didn't want trouble, but I was starting to get irritated. This pattern continued for months. Every single time I played music, watched a movie, or even had the TV on at normal volume, she'd call the cops. It didn't matter what time of day it was or how reasonable my volume level was. The officers started recognizing me and would show up looking increasingly frustrated. By the 10th time I knew all their names. Officer Johnson and Officer Martinez were the usual pair who responded to my building. Johnson told me they knew this was getting ridiculous. Martinez said my neighbors seemed to think any sound from my apartment was too much. I asked him what I was supposed to do, sit in complete silence in my own home that I pay rent for. Johnson said legally I wasn't doing anything wrong and they had to respond to calls, but they could see this was becoming a pattern. The 12th time was on a Sunday evening. I was watching a comedy special at barely audible volume, and sure enough, here come the cops again. I decided to ask them something important. I wanted to know if there was any law against repeatedly filing false police reports. They looked at each other with this expression that told me they'd been thinking the same thing. Martinez explained that filing false reports or abusing emergency services can result in fines and penalties. Johnson added that if someone is consistently wasting police resources with unfounded complaints, there can be repercussions. I pointed out that this was getting out of hand and that, as a taxpayer, having officers come to my door twice a week for absolutely no reason seemed like a waste of everyone's time. Martinez agreed that I made a valid point. Johnson said they would make note of the pattern in their reports. That was the last time I saw them at my door. For weeks after that conversation, I waited for the familiar knock whenever I turned on my TV or stereo, but it never came. About a month later, I ran into the building's janitor in the lobby. He's this friendly older guy who knows everyone's business because people always chat with him while he's working. He asked me if I knew my neighbor next door. I said, yeah, the lady who hates any sound louder than a whisper. He told me that was the one and said she was complaining to him last week about getting some big fine in the mail. I asked what kind of fine. He explained that apparently the police department sent her a bill for all those false reports she kept making, something about wasting city resources and filing frivolous complaints. I asked if he was serious. He said she was furious, going on about how unfair it was and how she was just trying to keep the building peaceful. He told me he just nodded and kept mopping while she ranted. After months of having my quiet evenings interrupted by police visits, dealing with the stress of potentially getting in trouble for doing absolutely nothing wrong, and having to constantly second-guess whether my own reasonable volume levels were somehow offensive, she finally faced some real repercussions. She still lives next door, but now when I watch movies or listen to music at perfectly normal volumes, there's no banging on walls, no dirty looks in the hallway, and definitely no more police visits. Sometimes I catch her looking at me when we pass each other, but she keeps her mouth shut. My husband and I have been married for 15 years, and for most of that time his mother has made it clear that I'm not good enough for her precious son. When we first got engaged, she pulled my husband aside and told him he was making a huge mistake. She said I was a Mormon like them and that my full-time job as a marketing coordinator made me unsuitable for marriage. She told him I would corrupt him with my worldly ways. The fact that I was raised Lutheran but consider myself agnostic now just made things worse in her eyes. For years, I've tried to keep the peace for my husband's sake. When she makes snide comments about my career, I bite my tongue. When she criticizes how I dress or parent my kids, I just smile and change the subject. But things got really bad when my daughter started getting older. My daughter is 11 now, and she's this amazing, bright kid who wants to be a veterinarian when she grows up. She loves animals, gets great grades, and has this wonderful curiosity about the world. But my mother-in-law sees her as a project to fix. Last month, my daughter wore a sundress to a family barbecue. Nothing inappropriate, just a cute dress that hit right above her knees. My mother-in-law pulled her aside and told her she needed to wear leggings with the dress or she would make God upset. She explained that when God gets upset, he sends people to bad places. My 11-year-old daughter came home that night asking me if she was going to hell because of her dress. I was furious, but my husband just said his mother was old-fashioned and meant well. Then there was the career conversation. My daughter was excitedly telling everyone at dinner about a science project she was doing about animal biology, talking about how it was helping her prepare for her dream of becoming a vet. My mother-in-law told her that proper ladies don't work outside the home and should focus on raising families instead of playing with dirty animals. The look on my daughter's face broke my heart. She treats my 8-year-old son completely differently. When he says he wants to be a firefighter, she tells him how proud she is and how strong and brave he'll be. The favoritism is so obvious it's painful to watch. My husband usually defends me when his mother gets out of line, but he always does it privately. He never calls her out in the moment, which means my daughter keeps getting hurt. Everything came to a head 3 weeks ago when we got news that my mother-in-law's health was declining. She's 78 and has been having mobility issues along with some cognitive problems. The doctor said she needed full-time care and the nurses who currently visit every other day weren't enough anymore. That's when my husband dropped the bomb. He told me he thought we should move his mother into our house because she needed family around her. I asked him if he had lost his mind, reminding him that she could barely stand to be in the same room as me for 2 hours at family dinners. He insisted that she was his mother and she was sick. He pointed out that we had the space and could hire nurses to come every day instead of every other day. This woman has spent 15 years making me feel unwelcome in my own extended family, had been psychologically tormenting my daughter, and now he wanted to invite her to live in our house. I asked about his brother, but he reminded me that his brother was in rehab again and couldn't take care of anyone. When I suggested a retirement home with nice facilities and full medical staff, his face turned red. He told me he couldn't believe I would suggest dumping his mother somewhere like she was a stranger. I reminded him that she was also the woman who told our daughter she was going to hell for wearing a dress and that her dreams don't matter because she's a girl. He promised he would talk to her about her behavior if she moved in, but I pointed out that he'd been promising to talk to her for 15 years and it had never worked. The argument went on for hours. He kept saying it was his duty as a son, and I kept explaining how toxic she was for our kids. Neither of us would budge. Then last night we had the fight that changed everything. I was making dinner when he brought it up again. He told me he'd been thinking about it and had made his decision that his mother was moving in next month. I reminded him that we hadn't agreed to anything, but he said this wasn't a democracy and that she was his mother. When I asked about our children and the damage he'd already done to our daughter's self-esteem, he dismissed my concerns and called me dramatic. He said a little old-fashioned advice never hurt anyone. That's when I lost it. I told him that what he called old-fashioned advice was actually teaching our daughter to be ashamed of her body and her ambitions. I explained that she was creating gender-based trauma that our daughter would carry for years. Then he said something that shocked me. He told me that if I didn't like it, I could move out of the house, but he wasn't moving his mother into a retirement home. I stared at him and asked if he had really just told me to leave. He said he was telling me that his mother comes first, and if I couldn't accept that, maybe I should reconsider my priorities. That was 2 days ago, and we haven't spoken since except about basic household logistics. Yesterday, while he was at work, I got a call from my mother-in-law herself. She said she had heard about the disagreement between me and her son. After I gave her a cold greeting, she told me she wanted me to know that she had never asked to move into our house and actually thought it was a terrible idea. I was confused, so she continued. She explained that while she didn't approve of how I lived my life, she wasn't senile either. She knew I didn't want her there, and frankly, she didn't want to live somewhere she wasn't wanted either. When I asked why she hadn't told her son this, she said it was because he was determined to play the devoted son and wouldn't listen to reason. But she said she had another solution. It turns out she had already been looking at assisted living facilities with her doctor's help, behind my husband's back. She found one she liked that specialized in her specific health needs and had already put down a deposit. She told me that while she might not like me, she respected that I was trying to protect my children from her opinions. She admitted she was from a different generation, and perhaps some of her views were better kept to herself. I almost fell off my chair. Was she actually showing self-awareness? She said she would be telling her son about her decision that night and suggested I be there to witness it. That evening, she came over for dinner. My husband was practically glowing, thinking she was there to discuss moving in details. He excitedly told her how they were going to have her live with us and that he'd already started clearing out the spare room. She told him that was actually what she wanted to discuss and that she had decided to move into Sunset Manor assisted living instead. You should have seen his face. He looked like she'd slapped him. He asked what she meant and reminded her that they had talked about this, saying that family takes care of family. She explained that family also respects each other's boundaries. She said she wouldn't be happy living in a house where she was resented, and I wouldn't be happy having her there. She told him this was better for everyone. My husband asked if I had put her up to this decision and turned to look at me, but his mother quickly corrected him. She told him that I had nothing to do with her decision, and that she had made this choice because she finally realized that her opinions about my life had been unwelcome and potentially harmful to our children. She continued by saying that while she might be old-fashioned, she wasn't cruel. She said that if her presence in the house would damage our family further, then she chose to live elsewhere. My husband tried to argue for another hour, but she had made up her mind. She is moving into the facility next week, and they have an excellent medical staff that can provide the care she needs. When my daughter found out her grandmother wouldn't be moving in, she actually seemed relieved. And when my mother-in-law said goodbye, she did something that shocked everyone. She told my daughter that she owed her an apology and said she hoped someday My daughter would make an excellent veterinarian. She said she was sorry she had suggested otherwise. My daughter just nodded quietly, but I could see some tension leave her shoulders. My husband is still barely speaking to me, convinced I somehow manipulated his mother into this decision. I think his mother finally realized that her son was about to choose her toxic behavior over his own family's well-being, and she decided to be the bigger person. My manager Karen had been with the company for 5 years. She was in her early 40s, always dressed professionally, and seemed to know what she was doing. At first, I actually looked up to her. She was confident, spoke well in meetings, and the senior staff seemed to respect her. But after a few months, I started noticing things that didn't add up. It started small. I'd process vendor invoices and notice some payments going to companies I'd never heard of. When I asked Karen about them, she would wave me off and tell me not to worry about those payments. She claimed they were special contracts she handled directly and that I should just process them like normal. I pressed her about not being able to find any purchase orders or contracts for these vendors in our system. Karen brushed off my concerns, explaining that these were confidential deals that the executives didn't want everyone seeing. She told me to trust her and just do my job. Something felt off, but I was new and didn't want to make waves. I kept doing what she asked, but I started keeping my own records of these suspicious transactions. My accounting professor always taught us to document everything. Over the next few months, the pattern became clearer. These mystery payments were happening every 2 weeks, always for amounts just under $5,000. The vendor names were generic too, things like Business Solutions Incorporated and Professional Services Limited Liability Company. When I tried looking them up online, most didn't have websites or any real business presence. The breaking point came when I was working late one evening trying to close out the monthly books. Karen had left hours earlier, but her computer was still logged in. I needed to access some files she'd been working on, so I went to her desk. That's when I saw an email that made my blood run cold. The email was from someone with the same last name as Karen, thanking her for the latest payment and asking when the next one would arrive. The email signature showed it was from Business Solutions Incorporated, one of the vendors I've been processing payments for. I realized Karen had been creating fake vendors and funneling money to herself and probably family members. Over the months I'd been there, I calculated she'd stolen at least $60,000, maybe more. I spent the weekend agonizing over what to do. Part of me wanted to just look the other way. I needed this job and Karen could make my life miserable if I crossed her. But I couldn't live with myself knowing I was helping someone steal from the company. Monday morning, I gathered all my documentation and went straight to Human Resources. The Human Resources director listened to everything and immediately called the CEO. Within an hour, they had Karen's computer seized and called in a forensic accountant. By Tuesday afternoon, they had enough evidence to fire Karen on the spot. The CEO called an emergency meeting with all the accounting staff to address the situation. He explained that they had discovered some serious financial irregularities that required immediate action. He announced that Karen's employment had been terminated and that they had turned the matter over to the authorities. I felt relieved but nervous. I knew Karen would figure out I was the one who reported her. I didn't have to wait long. Wednesday morning, I was at my desk when I heard shouting from across the office. Karen was demanding to know where that little snitch was, yelling that she knew I was there somewhere. I looked up to see Karen storming through the office, carrying what looked like a wooden baseball bat. Security hadn't made it to the front desk yet. She must have slipped in behind other employees. Karen spotted me and screamed that there I was. She called me an ungrateful little brat and said I had ruined her life. Everyone in the office froze. Karen was walking straight toward me, gripping the bat with both hands. I tried to calm her down and suggested we talk about the situation. Karen exploded, saying there was nothing to talk about because I had destroyed everything. She screamed that she had kids to feed and that I had no idea what I had done. I reminded her that she had stolen money from the company and that I couldn't just ignore that. Karen insisted that she had only borrowed it and was going to pay it back. She raised the bat above her head and pure instinct kicked in. I jumped up from my chair and started running toward the back of the office. weaving between desks and cubicles. Karen chased after me, yelling that I should get back there because I was going to pay for what I'd done. She swung the bat at computer monitors and office chairs in her fury while she pursued me through the maze of workstations. Other employees were diving under desks or running for the exits. Someone was screaming. Karen's footsteps were pounding behind me, getting closer. Just when I thought she was going to catch me, I heard the thundering footsteps of our security team. Two guards came around the corner and saw Karen mid-swing with the bat. The first security guard shouted for her to drop the weapon and get on the ground immediately. Karen screamed back that I had ruined her life and that I deserved what was coming to me. The first guard tackled Karen from behind, sending her crashing into a filing cabinet. The bat went flying across the room. Karen's face hit the metal corner of the cabinet hard, and I heard a sickening crack. The second guard helped pin Karen down while she thrashed and screamed. Blood was pouring from her mouth. Karen was crying about her tooth, saying that they had broken it. Sure enough, one of her front teeth was lying on the floor next to the filing cabinet. Karen was crying and spitting blood while the guards held her down. Within minutes, police sirens filled the parking lot. 4 officers rushed into the building and took over from security. They cuffed Karen and read her rights while paramedics checked her injuries. One officer told her she was under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon, criminal threats, and trespassing. Karen protested that this wasn't fair and that I was the real criminal who had destroyed her family. When they loaded Karen into the ambulance, she kept screaming at me through the window, saying that this wasn't over and that she would get me for this. But it was over. Karen was charged with embezzlement, assault with a deadly weapon, making criminal threats, and several other charges. The stolen money was traced to bank accounts in her name and her brother's name. She eventually pleaded guilty and got 3 years in prison. The company gave me a promotion and a raise for my honesty and integrity. My co-workers, who initially seemed shocked that I'd reported Karen, eventually thanked me when they realized she'd been stealing money that could have gone to employee bonuses or raises. I was decent at math. Not like genius level or anything, but numbers just made sense to me in a way they didn't for most of my classmates. When I hit 7th grade, I was already helping other kids with their homework and getting A's on most of my tests without breaking much of a sweat. Our middle school was one of those places where sports ruled everything. If you could throw a ball or run fast, you were basically royalty. Everyone else, we were just background noise. I fell squarely into that second category. Average height, skinny, more interested in comic books than touchdowns. I wasn't bullied exactly, but I definitely wasn't popular either. The basketball team was especially worshipped at our school. They'd won some regional championship the year before, and the players acted like they owned the place. Teachers gave them special treatment, other students fought for their attention, and they could pretty much get away with anything. One of these star players ended up in my advanced math class. He was this tall, confident guy who sat in the back making jokes with his friends. Everyone loved him. He had that easy charm that made teachers smile even when he was being disruptive. The problem was, he was terrible at math. Like really terrible. I first noticed something was off during our second week of class. We'd gotten assigned seats, and by pure bad luck, I ended up right next to him. During our first quiz, I kept feeling like someone was watching me. Every time I looked over, he was looking straight at my paper, not even trying to be subtle about it. At first I thought maybe I was imagining things, but then it happened again during the next quiz. And the one after that. This guy was straight up copying my answers, and he wasn't even embarrassed about it. He'd lean over so far that I could smell his cologne, crane his neck to get a better view of my work, and then quickly scribble down whatever I had written. The worst part was how entitled he acted about it, like it was my job to help him cheat. He never said thank you, never acknowledged what he was doing, never even made eye contact with me. He just assumed he had the right to copy my work because, what? Because he was popular? Because he played basketball? It made my blood boil. I thought about telling our teacher, but that seemed like social suicide. Our school had a strict no-snitching culture, and I was already awkward enough without adding tattletale to my reputation. Plus, this guy had friends everywhere. If I got him in trouble, I'd probably end up having a much worse time at school. So I suffered through it for a few weeks, watching my hard work get stolen quiz after quiz. He'd get decent grades, not great, but passing while I did all the actual thinking. It felt so unfair. Then one day I had enough. We were getting ready for another quiz, and I could already see him positioning himself to get the best view of my paper. He was being even more obvious than usual, practically leaning into my desk space. That's when I decided to do something about it. I came up with a plan that felt absolutely brilliant to my 12-year-old brain. Instead of trying to hide my paper better or asking to switch seats, I was going to give him exactly what he wanted. My answers, just not the right ones. When the teacher handed out the quiz, I started working through the problems like normal. But instead of writing down my real answers, I put down wrong ones. I made sure they looked believable, not obviously stupid, but incorrect enough that anyone copying them would fail. The hardest part was keeping track of everything in my head. I had to solve each problem correctly first, then figure out a wrong answer that seemed reasonable, write that down, and remember what the real answer was for later. It took way more mental energy than just doing the quiz normally, but seeing him frantically copying my fake answers made it worth every second. He was being so obvious about it that I almost felt embarrassed for him. He'd wait for me to finish each problem, then immediately write down whatever I had. When I moved to the next question, he'd follow. It was like watching someone cheat in slow motion. About halfway through the quiz, I started having doubts. What if my plan backfired somehow? What if the teacher noticed something weird? But then I'd catch him stealing another answer, and my resolve would strengthen. This guy needed to learn that actions have results. When I finished the last problem with another deliberately wrong answer, I pretended to review my work while keeping an eye on him. He was still copying, racing to get down my final few responses before time was called. He probably thought he'd aced another quiz thanks to my work. The teacher said time was up and told everyone to pass their quizzes forward. This was the moment I've been waiting for. I stretched and acted like I was getting ready to stand up, making a big show of preparing to turn in my paper. Just like I'd hoped, he immediately jumped up with his quiz in hand, eager to be done with the whole thing. He practically sprinted to the front of the room. When he was out of his seat, I quickly went through my quiz and changed every single answer to the correct ones that I'd been keeping in my head. My pencil moved fast while I fixed problem after problem, erasing his copied wrong answers and replacing them with the real solutions. When he got back to his seat, I was walking up to turn in my corrected quiz. The next few days were torture. I kept wondering if my plan had worked, or if I'd somehow messed it up. What if he'd noticed me changing answers? What if the teacher had seen something suspicious? But I tried to act normal and wait for the results. When we got our quizzes back, I could barely contain my excitement. I got a 90%, one of my better scores that semester. But the real victory was watching his face when he saw his grade. He stared at his paper like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. A big red 60% was written at the top, along with several wrong marks throughout. He quietly asked how this could have happened. For probably the first time all semester, he was looking directly at me, waiting for an answer. I told him that he should keep his eyes on his own paper, then turned back to my desk like nothing had happened. He looked confused, mixed with the slow realization that he'd been caught. After that day, I never saw him try to copy my work again. He'd still sit next to me since we had assigned seats, but he kept his eyes on his own quiz during tests. I moved in with my current roommate about 8 months ago after my previous living arrangement fell through. My old roommate got a job offer across the country and left with barely 2 weeks' notice, leaving me scrambling to find someone to split the rent with. The apartment was perfect for my budget when split between 2 people, but alone it would eat up almost 70% of my income from my job at the local coffee shop. I found her through a Facebook group for people looking for roommates in our area. She seemed normal enough in her messages, talked about how she was between jobs but actively looking, and promised she was reliable with payments. She had references from previous roommates who said she was clean and quiet. What they didn't mention was her complete inability to hold down steady employment. The first month went fine. She paid her half on time, kept her mess to her own space, and we got along well enough. But then month 2 came around and suddenly she was short $50. She promised to have it by the 5th, then the 10th, then she just stopped mentioning it altogether. I let it slide because everyone has tough months, right? Month 3, she was short again. This time it was $120 because she had some unexpected expenses. Month 4, she could only pay half her portion. Month 5 was when the pattern became crystal clear. She got a part-time job at a retail store, but quit after 2 weeks because she told me her manager was toxic for expecting her to show up on time. Then came month 6, where she announced she was starting a small online business selling handmade jewelry and would definitely be able to pay me back everything she owed once it took off. The business lasted 3 weeks before she decided the market was too saturated and gave up. Month 7 was when she got another part-time job, this time at a local restaurant, but quit after a week because she said the work was too demanding. Each month, I found myself covering more and more of the rent while she came up with increasingly creative excuses. My savings account was getting dangerously low, and I was picking up extra shifts at the coffee shop just to keep us afloat. I tried talking to her about it several times, but she always had a reason why things would be different next month. Which brings us to this month's disaster. 3 days before rent was due, she cornered me in the kitchen while I was making my morning coffee before my shift. She asked me about rent this month, and when I asked what she meant, she dropped the bomb that she couldn't pay her half it all. She said she knew it was short notice but asked if I could just cover it and that she'd totally pay me back once she found something steady. I set down my coffee mug and really looked at her. She was standing there in a brand new outfit I'd seen her post about on social media the day before, talking about her little shopping therapy session. I told her I couldn't do that because I was already stretched thin from covering the extra amount she couldn't pay the last few months. She said we were roommates and were supposed to have each other's backs. I explained that I understood she was in a tough spot, but I wasn't exactly swimming in cash either and had been picking up extra shifts just to cover what she couldn't pay before. Then she asked if I was just going to let us get evicted. I reminded her that the rent was due on the 1st regardless of how either of us felt about it, and that she'd had a whole month to figure this out. She stared at me like I just told her the sky was green, said wow, just wow, then walked off to her room and slammed the door. A few hours later, she came back out while I was watching TV and launched into what I can only describe as a complete meltdown. She told me she'd been thinking about our conversation earlier and needed me to know that what I was doing was financial abuse. When I asked what she was talking about, she explained that I was using money to control her and stress her out on purpose. She said I knew she was struggling with her mental health right now, and I was choosing to prioritize bills over her well-being. She called it toxic behavior. I actually had to pause and replay what she'd just said in my head because it was so absurd. I told her I wasn't trying to control her or stress her out, that I was just telling her I couldn't cover her portion of rent this month. I explained that I'd already helped her out for months and literally couldn't afford to do it anymore. She insisted that I knew how hard things were for her right now, and that a good roommate would understand that sometimes you need to make sacrifices for the people you live with. She said the fact that I was choosing money over her mental health showed exactly what kind of person I was. I responded that being broke doesn't mean you don't deserve love or support, but it also doesn't mean other people are obligated to pay your bills indefinitely. She accused me of being deliberately cruel, saying I knew she was sensitive about money issues because of her anxiety and that I was weaponizing that against her. I tried to explain that I got that she was stressed, but the rent was still due on the 1st whether she was stressed about it or not. I pointed out that the landlord doesn't care about our personal situations. She called me a terrible person and said I was supposed to be her friend, but I was acting like some heartless landlord. She said she couldn't believe she had to live with someone so selfish and toxic. She walked back to her room and hasn't spoken a word to me since. But that doesn't mean she's been quiet about it. For the past week, she's been posting cryptic messages on all her social media accounts. Things like being broke doesn't mean you don't deserve love, and sometimes the people closest to you show their true colors, and financial abuse is real, and it's not okay. She's been sharing articles about toxic roommates and posting inspirational quotes about standing up to bullies, she's been getting sympathy comments from people who have no idea what's actually happening. Her friends are telling her she deserves better and that she should move out of such a toxic environment. Meanwhile, I'm still here paying the full rent because guess what? The landlord still wanted his money on the first, regardless of her mental health journey or her social media activism. Yesterday, I got a text from her sister asking if we could work something out because my roommate was really struggling and needed support, not judgment. Apparently, I'm now the villain in a story where I'm somehow both financially abusing someone and also paying all their bills. This morning, I was getting ready for work when I heard her on the phone in her room, talking loudly enough that I couldn't help but overhear. She was telling someone that I was being totally unreasonable, that she'd asked me to help her out just this once, and I'd gone completely psycho about it. She described me as one of those people who thinks money is more important than human relationships and said she was honestly scared to live here now because I was creating such a hostile environment. I had to laugh. Just this once? Try 6 months of just this once. But here's where things got interesting. Later that day, our landlord called me directly. He said he wanted to give me a heads up that my roommate had contacted him asking about breaking the lease early. He told me she had said there was some kind of conflict between us over the rent payments. When I asked what exactly she had said, he explained that she claimed I was harassing her about money and making the living situation unbearable. But then he told me something interesting. He said he got to tell me that my rent payments had been coming from just my account for the last 4 months, and he'd been wondering when someone was going to address that. Turns out the landlord had been watching the payment patterns and knew exactly what was going on. He told me that if she wanted to break the lease, she'd still be responsible for her portion of the remaining months and that he'd be happy to work with me to find a replacement roommate who actually pays their share. When I told her about the landlord's call, her tune changed real quick. She asked if he'd really told me she wanted to break the lease, claiming she was just asking about her options hypothetically. I mentioned that he'd said she told him I was harassing her about money. She quickly backtracked, saying she never said harassing and that she just said there was tension. Then I delivered the real news. I told her the landlord had also mentioned that he'd been tracking which account the rent payments come from, and he knew she hadn't paid her portion in months. Her face went completely white. She asked if he really knew that, and I told her that apparently landlords pay attention to these things. Who knew? She's been a lot quieter on social media lately. Funny how that works. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.